All right, good morning. Have we hit the record button, Alani or Robbie? Awesome. Good morning. Thank you all for being here 8:30 on a Friday morning after many of you have been here for much of the week. Just want to say we're super grateful for you being here. To our panelists, we'll get to introductions in a minute, but just want to say, we're really appreciative of you taking the time and helping inform this overall resilient Lee plan that we're trying to build for Lee County. Before we get into some introductions, what I would like to share is that this is being streamed live and recorded. So you all have microphones at your tables. So for our friends on Zoom, please make sure you hit the little button and the light goes from red to green and you hold it close to your mouth so folks on Zoom can hear you when you're speaking. We have a large panel. And we have about 2 hours together this morning. So we have to make sure that we don't have to answer every question unless we really want to answer every question. So this will be a facilitated back and forth conversation around financial incentives for attainable and resilient housing. Branch members, this is to help inform some of the initial priority areas. So this is intended to be a back and forth conversation. You are part of the conversation. So don't feel like you have to raise your hand or whatever. If my colleague on the other side and we will make sure that we see if folks do want to participate. To branch members that are on Zoom, please drop any questions or comments that you have in the chat for the panel, and our colleague Harrison over here, he'll make sure that those questions and comments get to the panel. Today's solutions focused. We're talking about solutions, big picture, long term. Yes, Hurricane Ian has created this opportunity to have this conversation, but this is thinking about resiliency from a long-term perspective. What does resilient Lee County actually look like if we were to think 20 years from now, 10 years from now? And so this is the level of conversations that we've been having all week. So with that, we'll do some quick introductions. Hey, Alani, can you get me on the slides, please? Thank you. So we'll do some quick introductions. We do have one panelist on Zoom we'll grab at the end, but my name is John Romine. I'm part of the support team for the Recovery Task Force. I'm also part of the team here at Collaboratory. And I'm, again, just super grateful that you all were able to make it today. And we'll start with you, Jeannie.
Good morning, Jeannie Sutton with Lee County.
John Talmadge, I work with Jeannie Sutton.
Good morning, Frank Wells with Bright Community Trust.
Tom Rossi, Renaissance Development.
Amy Yearsley, City of Cape Coral.
Nelson Taylor of the LSI Companies.
Marcus Goodson, Lee County Housing Authority.
Terry Ware. I'm helping John facilitate this morning.
And to our panelists on Zoom.
Oh, good morning. It's Joe Benora with Catalyst Asset Management.
Great. Is that the only one? Two more? The other panelists on Zoom? David? And who else? And Stan. Come off mute and introduce yourselves, please.
Stan Gemont.
Sorry about that. Dave Heidi, City of Cape Coral.
And Stan Gemont with Haggerty Consulting.
Great, thank you. And again, our deepest gratitude for all of the panelists taking their time. And then additionally, gratitude to folks that are sitting in the front of the room as well. They are the members of the branches, which we'll touch on here in a second. Robbie. All right, so we're going to do a high-level overview of what the Recovery Task Force is. So Recovery Task Force is something that happens in communities across the country after disasters. It's based on the FEMA framework. Our specific Recovery Task Force in Lee County is chaired by the Board of County Commissioners, specifically Commissioner Kevin Ruane. And the remaining 12 seats are made up of the elected bodies across Lee County. So we have the municipalities, law enforcement, the fire districts, the school board, the health system, our legislative delegation, and then a representative from our constitutional office. The structure of the recovery task force is based on these 8 branches. So you have planning and capacity, which is looking at the broader view of the entire county, specifically as it relates to that branch. They're looking at an overall resilience overlay. Economic recovery, education and workforce, health and social services, infrastructure, housing, which is the topic of conversation today, which is chaired by Gary Griffin, natural resources and cultural resources. And so all of these branches, they meet on a monthly basis. They meet here at Collaboratory. Those meetings are public meetings. Anybody can attend. There's public comment at the end, similar to today for the public. There is an opportunity for public comment at the end. All of this information can be also found on the resiliently.com website. We've been on a bit of an aggressive time frame, to say the least. So we started in late February, early March on this process. And really, we've been gathering information. So the branches have been meeting once a month and really starting to identify those initial priority areas that are the focus for those 8 different branches that they see as a need in the community. The branches are made up of members of the community, and I can't say that enough, that the goal of this overall plan that we're driving towards is intended to be informed by the community. We just exited a massive community engagement effort across all of the planning communities in Lee County. We'll touch on the details of that a little bit, where we gathered additional information at the community level, the neighborhood level, to understand what their priorities are for a more resilient Lee County. All of this work is driving towards a December 5th Board of County Commissioner meeting, where they will vote on the recovery and resiliency plan for Lee County. And so we're now in the solutions mode. So taking all of the information, taking everything that we've learned from the branches, from the community, from some of our online engagement, to really start to identify what are those priorities, what are those solutions for the long term for our community. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. The panelists were recommended for the most part by the branch members. These are the experts, subject matter experts from whether it's locally or across the country, to really start to inform what those solutions are for Lee County. As it relates to community engagement, we hosted between middle of April and end of May, we hosted 17 town halls. 15 of them were in person, 2 were virtual. We offered them in English and Spanish. We had a little over 1,000 folks participate across the community in the town halls, in person or online. And then we also have, it's still live on the website, the resiliently.com website, a survey for folks to weigh in and participate on what their priorities are and what some potential solutions are they see for our community. And so we have had almost 5,000 folks participate in that survey. And then on March 30th of this year, we had a region-wide event. So it included Charlotte, Collier, Henry, and Glades counties as well. It was a day-long event where folks gathered around for a meal, for coffee, and it was called On the Table, and really weighed in on what are their priorities and what are the things that folks want to solve in the community. What I will say, and I'm sure nobody in this room is surprised by this, all of the data before the storm, after the storm, housing is the #1 priority in our community. It's a workforce problem, in case you didn't know. It's an economic development challenge. It's a affordability challenge. It's a location challenge. It's a transportation challenge. It has been identified as the #1 priority. So we really hope today we can get to some solutions that will drive towards how we start to solve for that over the next several years. So this week has been all about workshops. Next week, for those of you want to come back, is all about branches. And we started on Monday. Monday was all about critical infrastructure minus power. So power workshop, the power infrastructure workshop will be on June 21st here at Collaboratory at 2 o'clock. We struggled to get all of the right players in the room for that conversation. And so that will be the only workshop that we do not have this week. On Wednesday, we focused on supporting business and workforce. And guess what? Housing was a big part of that conversation. Yesterday was all about community resilience. And then again, today is all about housing. So the goal of the workshops is really to start to identify and understand. So, the branch members in the community have identified some of the opportunities and the priorities. It's really to help inform how we actually build those out. How do we leverage this once in a generational opportunity of funding that will be coming to our community for the foreseeable future? How do we leverage that to make a more resilient Lee County? And that's what we're here today. And so, as I shared before, branch members that are joining us virtually, please drop your comments or questions in the chat. And then for panelists that are in the chat, also, please make sure you drop those questions and comments in the chat, or raise your hand and we are monitoring that as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce part of our Haggerty team that's colleagues here and partners that are here. Harrison Newton is really one of the key drivers of what we're going to gather today. And then we have team members that are gathering the information in real time of what you share. So Harrison, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Harrison Newton, Haggerty Consulting on the Resilient Lee support team in partnership with Collaboratory, and I lead the resilience portfolio. Thanks.
So anything that you share today will be captured, and we hope that as we get a little bit later in the conversation, we will be able to start to really identify what some priority areas are. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry to start the dialogue around what we're doing.
Thanks, John. I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here. A lot of good minds in this room. So I just have a couple of comments and slides I'm going to run through to help frame this discussion. I use this one often because I was looking at the agenda for the meeting, and there's a discussion about the financial component, the incentives that are available, how to finance development. There's a discussion about the availability of land and development regulations. But the two components in here that I didn't see discussed that I want to make sure that we keep in the top of our mind, the marketplace, wages, the availability of land, the cost of land, and the market's always fluctuating up and down. So that's a key component. And then the other for me, which is a major piece, is the political context in which we operate. California, Governor Newsom, they just passed regulations requiring each community to submit a housing plan. Without the housing plan, they don't get funding. Many communities are pushing back issues of local control, etc. I'm from Colorado. Colorado's governor just failed trying to push housing incentives through the legislature to try and encourage communities. And the idea behind both of those, Colorado's was sort of formed after California, the idea about by right development, as well as the issue about regional sharing of affordable housing. And, that's a tremendous thing. New York state legislature just failed trying to push together. So we can't forget the political environment in which we operate. NIMBYism, YIMBYism, those are major components. So another way of saying this, what is the property owner what to do? What will the market support? What role should government play? Which is, when we talk about incentives, most of those incentives, be it zoning, financial subsidies, etc., typically come from the public sector side. It's my belief that development primarily occurs as a result of private sector investment. So it's a combination of those two. I've played a variety of roles in state and local government as a consultant, as a developer's representative, as an architect, and sort of seen all sides of this. I was on the Denver Housing Authority board for many years, urban renewal director. I've sort of seen how this plays out. And I think, trying to make sure that we are aware of each of these components and how they play in this, I think is really important. Typically, when we just talk about, unsubsidized development, there are various components to that. You can see this is typically how it breaks out, soft costs, financing, etc. In this particular, valuation or pro forma, the construction costs were a fairly minor part of it. But if you look at the subsidized pro forma, it's construction costs typically where most of the incentives occur in terms of trying to reduce costs. Really, the goal here is to try and reduce the risk to the developer. Once again, the market plays a major component. So in an emerging or soft market, the need for additional investments on the public sector side tend to be greater. In the strong market economy, those things kind of go away, and there's the potential opportunity to get community benefits. I'm sure most of you have heard the community benefits agreements that are sort of flowing across the country. But, once again, Denver, we just had a major election in which a property owner who bought land was turned down by a citywide vote for a development in which they were promising pretty much, a chicken in every pot. And so that sort of YIMBYism thing works in many communities. And then going back to the market issue, particularly when we're talking about affordable housing, we're talking about those individuals who are renters at 80% AMI and below. And if you're talking about people in the service industry, they typically tend to be in that category of 60% and below because of the low wages component. And so now you're talking about development that requires significant subsidies to offset the cost of those development factors. And then this is the last slide. When we look at incentives, typically density bonuses are the major one, be it inclusive or exclusive zoning ordinances. It's typically density bonuses that are the major public incentive. What does that mean in a community that's primarily, low to moderate, low scale for the most part, suburban sprawl? When you talk about density and affordable housing, that's why workforce housing has now become the buzzword. We talk about teachers and firemen and policemen, quite honestly, because it's an easier way to get that discussion going in the community. Let's be honest about it. But, what does density look like? Does the market support density? The additional construction costs, because, the 5/1 that's typical in many communities requires different fire code requirements. So how does that play out? Zoning variances, reduction of fees. I mean, these are all sort of the typical and, things that we've used. So this isn't new territory. I mean, I know, given the background of many of you, you've dealt with these issues. And so today, I think we really want to dive deep into how this looks in this context, in this community. And once again, I think this is the last slide. What are those areas of opportunity? Creating a streamlined entitlement process. We're going to talk about that later this afternoon. Reducing parking. Many communities have eliminated the parking requirement, but really, how effective is that? I mean, if I'm an apartment developer providing that additional space for someone who lives in my building, you don't have to, require me to do parking. I'm probably going to do it anyway. And if you look at the share of people who use public transit, it's pretty small. For about 10 or 12 years, I worked in transit-oriented development in Honolulu and Denver and other components or places across the United States. And still, if you're talking about the home to work trip, that's pretty easy. But now we're in a remote environment where many people aren't doing that. And so transit ridership, Chicago, New York, and major centers has dropped dramatically. We talked about financing, TIF, low-income housing tax credits. As most of you know, when you're talking about affordable housing, talking about 4 or 5, 6, 7 layers of financing, bridge loans, mezzanine loans, et cetera, to put together a package. And then, your low-income housing tax credits flow out of that, but then the deadlines hit. And so now you're a developer. Okay, now I've lost that financing. Where do I go for that? Modular construction, big issue now. We're talking about container development. In preparation for this, a lot of research on that. The costs don't seem to be significantly less than stick-built development. So, is that really an opportunity for reducing costs? So I've talked enough. Really, this is an opportunity for you guys to talk and discuss these issues. So I think, now we're going to get into some of the specific issues and questions. Pardon me? Sure. Apologize. So, and getting the ball rolling, thank you. Are current financial incentives enough to offset the cost of development? And, you guys are obviously more in tune with what the local market here. Anyone want to jump in? How many people think the answer is yes? No, please raise your hands. Okay, well, I guess then why aren't they? I'm going to ask the panel, anyone jump in. Why aren't the present incentives enough to offset the cost of development? Is it land costs, construction costs?
Marcus Goodson, Lee County Housing Authority. I'll take the first stab at this. Yeah, the first thing is land costs. In Lee County, land is extremely expensive. There are not a lot of options out here in the county. In some cases, when you find land that will work perfect for a site, you've got to get it rezoned. You got to go through the rezoning process. We've had some cases over at Lee County Housing Authority where the rezoning didn't go through. We had a beautiful project teed up and ready to go. So that is a part of the issue as well. Of course, we know about increased construction costs. We know about increased interest rates. So there are a number of things that are working against us when we are out here trying to develop housing, especially affordable housing. Now, the private market housing will take care of itself because they're going to price it at a point where the rental revenue will cover their debt service. When it comes to affordable, that's another issue. So we're building similar product. We don't have the high-end appliances and those things, but block costs what block costs. The site work costs what the site work costs. And then we're out here renting the units, at significantly less prices to accommodate the families that earn 30%, 40% of AMI. So for us, it's a challenge. It's not anything that we can do without government subsidy, tax credits. We've had some tremendous success here in Lee County over the last 15 years that I've been involved in the public housing community. And we've had local support from not only the city of Fort Myers, but Cape Coral, city of Cape Coral, and also Lee County government. So the partnerships are there. The desire to build this housing is there, and been my experience. And there's a tremendous opportunity now that we have the money coming from the federal government. It's going to be a tremendous opportunity for this community to rebuild Lee County in a way that we'd like to see it rebuilt. We got to make sure that the traditionally underserved communities don't miss out on this opportunity as well. So I want to make sure that, that I highlight that point, that the traditionally underserved communities, Black and brown communities, we need to make sure that these communities benefit also from this redevelopment that's about to take place.
There's a lot there to unpack, that's for sure. I'm curious, how dependent is this development on federal subsidies? I mean, from outside money, is it possible that local communities can do this on their own?
Again, Marcus, listen, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but when it comes to affordable, we are extremely dependent on government subsidy. That's the only way it's going to work. The market rate stuff, as I said before, is going to take care of itself. When you ride around and you look at the construction that's happening in Lee County, I don't know, Dan, 95% of it is market rate. And you're talking $2,500 a month for a 2-bedroom. And again, we are building similar product where we're charging $400 and $500 per month. So you got to have the subsidies. Without the subsidies, it's not going to work. I'm excited about where we are. I'm excited about the opportunity. I hated that the hurricane hit, but I quickly realized a couple of days after the hurricane that we were going to have a tremendous opportunity to rebuild this community. I mean, I literally walked outside of my house and looked at the damage and I said, okay, it's here, but now we're going to have an opportunity, and the opportunity is here now. And so if we miss this opportunity, we will never get it again.
Other panel members, yes, sir, jump in.
I'll just add to what Marcus was saying, that I think that one of the things that's missing in Lee County is the mix of housing types. And so we build single family homes, we build garden style multifamily housing. But we have very few types in between, and we over amenitize a lot of our product, and add-on costs don't necessarily need to be in those costs for everybody. It's not that everyone doesn't deserve a house to live in a home with dignity, but a starter home is a starter home. And I think that the numbers that we broke out our numbers yesterday to distribute internally. Now we need about 50,000 homes, just to meet the need of people who are living in burdened and severely burdened households. The market will take care of some of that. But, right now we have 440,000 structures in Lee County, but only 1,400 subsidized homes. That's not including what Marcus built in the city of Fort Myers. But so the ratio of what's subsidized to what's market rate is, is severely lopsided. And by definition, an affordable home has to be a subsidized home, because if it's not subsidized, then it's just a market rate home. And so if you're going to look at a house that costs $300,000 a door to build, or an apartment, but you're showing your calculations, you're going to have to make up a gap somewhere. And whether that gap is free donation of land or it's a donation of grants, it has to be gapped. And so I think that that's just a realization, and we hide the fact of what we need by the different types of terms we use to define what we're trying to describe. We need We need affordable housing, whether that's low income housing, workforce housing. We have a problem with housing for seniors. There's a 10-year wait for subsidized ALF slots. How do you tell a 75-year-old elder that they have to wait 10 years to move into memory care? You don't. We have a problem with veterans housing. We have a problem with student housing. We have every category. We need to break those down, and understand what sub communities we need to be housing for, because they all have different solutions.
Sure.
But we just sort of lump it all together and say we need workforce housing, and that masks. And and I'll end with this, but our AMI is $87,000, which seems really high. Well, that masks, it's not a bell curve. It masks the high percent of that population that lives on $20,000 and $30,000. We have relatively few households that make $60,000 or $70,000.
Right in the middle, yeah.
So it's that, it's skewed to the bottom. And that's where those 50,000 homes are.
I see the John.
Before you jump in, Frank, I just want to follow up on something, John. So the comment about housing choices, right? It's been sort of a theme this week in every single workshop we've had. And so when you think about, as we try to understand what do we actually need for housing, has anything been done across Lee County as a whole to understand what the housing choices are that we need for our county, whether it's for today or for 10 years from now? So, we talk a lot about at the economic, the business recovery conversation. There's this conversation, we're building housing for people that were moving here 30 years ago. Well, what are we doing for the people that are going to be here 30 years from now? And so have we done anything in Lee County as a whole recently that starts to paint the picture of what those housing choices might need? And then obviously that would start to identify what are the solutions from a funding mechanism that we could create.
And we really haven't done enough. I mean, I'm glad that Joe Benora and Tom Rossi and Marcus are here, because they really are struggling or wrestling with the housing type question. We don't use enough 221D4 programs or HUD guarantees. We don't use new markets tax credits at all for housing. We use precious few of the number of federal tools we have access to that we're entitled to. I'm on the Florida Community Loan Fund Board, and we don't do any loans down here in NLP, Neighborhood Lending Partners, does precious few except for Habitat. And that's those are two CDFIs, statewide CDFIs. That's what they do. They lend to affordable housing communities. And so I think that some of the stuff that, like the project on Hanson Street, what Joe's doing in Midtown, it will have a diversity in housing product and sort of approach to what we're doing. But we really just haven't done enough. And we've always thought of North Cape and Lehigh as being our safety valves. Well, you know what? The average on Lehigh now, homes are $400,000, and the first home just sold for $1 million. And so, we take Lehigh off the table, LaBelle is the next one up.
So it's a regional approach. Thank you.
To tag on to what John said, I think it's important for us to keep in mind 50,000 units we need. We talk about $1.1 billion as if that's a practically limitless supply of dollars. But if you do the simple math, right, that maybe we need $100,000 of gap funding just for a family of 60% AMI, right? We're not even talking about 30%
per unit.
$100,000 of subsidy per unit. $1.1 billion if we dropped it all into housing gets us 11,000, right? So we're 20% of the way there. Can we just keep that for context, right? So if we don't do anything but throw money at the problem, we're not getting anywhere close to getting there. I appreciated your starting off with a comment about California, about what Colorado tried to pass and didn't, and so forth. I think it's much more instructive to look at what Montana did. Very politically similar to the state of Florida, supermajority Republican legislature, Republican governor, whose politics are very similar to ours. And they got a lot of housing reform passed from a very private property rights side of things. So they have any housing unit, any residential parcel in the state, in a city over 5,000 people, can build an ADU now, can build a duplex now. Right. So they're getting there from a whole different direction and getting regulation out of the way. They also have provisions very similar to Live Local to let you take commercial or industrial land and repurpose it for workforce residential usage. So we should be looking at, like you said, the political climate and trying to find political solutions that match our politics. I think that's a pretty important opportunity. I'll just share a couple of other things that crossed my mind as you were opening your presentation where we might find some traction. Density bonuses were mentioned, but I didn't see anything about parking reductions. I know you mentioned it in a conversation, but important, we can be thinking about things like district shared retention, district chilling and things like that, that let us use our land a little bit more efficiently. But that takes a lot of public-private partnership to really get that right. I think we should also not take the transportation piece out of the conversation. One, because it figures in people's very real household budgets, but also because it's an economic development factor for us. Our comparisons are not to New York City and Boston, right, with 100-year-old public transit systems. It's with the Charlottes and the Dallases of the world who are building new public transit infrastructure, and they're out competing almost everybody in Florida for business recruiting because they have that as a way to move their workforce around. So we've definitely got to be looking at that.
So Frank, I just want to follow up on a couple things. So you hit on a couple really great things related to land use policy, which we're going to get to in the next workshop. So I want to make sure we put a pin in that and don't forget about it. But this idea of it's not just investment and subsidies into the housing, it's also the infrastructure side of the equation that we have to make sure that we're having a conversation around. And the $1.1 billion conversation, that's just a piece of the puzzle. And we've gotten hung up on because it's $1.1 billion, it's HUD funding, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's a silver bullet. It's just the beginning. And so we have to be thinking about beyond what we're getting for the hurricane, like what are the financial incentives that we need to start thinking about, or what are the financial mechanisms? And it is around things like the relationship with infrastructure, the relationship with employment centers, and how that starts to look. Gary?
Without getting into the weeds, the Florida legislature did pass a bill this year that I'm told is going to be impactful. And you mentioned the Montana. Did the Florida bill, at least, was that a good start?
Yeah, great start.
And I think there is momentum there. So I'd like to make sure we can get behind. Typically, the legislature will do these things in 2 or 3 steps, and we have the leadership behind us now.
I've already been in Tallahassee meeting with legislators to talk about what Live Local 2.0 could look like. One gap that's missing in Live Local, for instance, we can reuse commercial or industrial land for residential multifamily rentals, right? Doesn't give me a solution for reusing that land to promote home ownership, right? There's no mechanism there for me to build townhomes or condos for teachers and folks in that entry level workforce to get to what John was describing, starter homes, right? So there are definitely things that are on the table where there's some good opportunity. And let's also keep on the table some of our local politics. The Senate president is from our region. We should definitely be capitalizing on that while that's true, right? It won't be true 18 months from now.
That's a critical point. That she's pushing this hard because a company a month is moving from Collier County to Lee County. And it's continuing. And Collier County doesn't have an answer by itself as a county to try to reverse that trend. And they won't build their way out of that trend, that problem right now. But one of the things that will say as the economic development director for the county is that finding a housing solution is as important to our economy as any other single thing that we're trying to address. And if we don't do that, we'll start losing our companies to other places.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in with one last thing. We did a housing affordability study last year for the city of Naples. And one really interesting thing to talk about why we need to understand what the data tells us in a little more detail. There are a million things in the study, but one thing, just as an example, when we really got down to the data and looked at not how many people do we have in what income brackets, that's a really big bucket, but what do those households really look like? 56% of renter households in the city of Naples have one person in them. 56%. So when we're talking about we need to build 3-bedroom units for families, sure, there's a need for that, but it's about this big, right? We got to be building more studios and one bedrooms, but we don't know that until we really, really get into the data and look to see what's the need. You know, what's the need for seniors? How many of those?
Yep.
How many veterans do we have for whom we need permanent supportive housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Jump in.
Yeah, so I wanted to speak to the live local part of it. So we broker a lot of land, and right after that act passed, the landowner called us expecting that his land actually went up in value because of the live local.
Right.
So he thought he was going to be able to build high rises on his property because of that. So I think one of the issues you have to look at is incentivizing it from the land aspect, from a affordable or obtainable, however you speak to it. Gets a better use of the land than a market rate guy. So when you look at the wetland impacts, fill cost, density issues, parking requirements, open space, architectural and landscape requirements, it's all very expensive. So from a different perspective is offsetting any of those, that if they went affordable, they could get a better use of it and actually pay equal or more than a market rate individual. So other than that, a landowner is not a generous giant. They're not going to sell their land for cheaper than what they could. So you have to offset that mentality.
Well, there are two comments in that. One is who pays for the infrastructure? You know, I mean, you can see it, you know, typically they're metro districts, at least in Colorado, that's how a lot of new development occurs. You know, because of the inability of public agencies to invest in new water and sewer. So a lot of those costs are pushed down to the developer. And then the other comment I wanted to ask the panel about is land acquisition. They're land trusts, et cetera, that are operating where you're basically removing the cost of land from the equation. So, I mean, other panelists, how are you? Yeah, Marcus.
Marcus Goodson, Lee County Housing Authority. Before we move too far off of Frank's comments about legislature and getting government involved at the highest level, which I agree with, that they're going to be supportive of housing. But let's think about what has happened here in the state of Florida. In 1992, Sadowski Act was created, SHIP funding, doc stamp money for affordable and workforce housing. Great idea. Everybody supported it, right? What has happened since? The legislature has raided that fund almost each year for other purposes than what it was intended for. So we got to make sure that we hold the politicians on the local level and state level at their word. If that's what the funding is for, use it for that. Don't raid it. And they raid it each year. So the state legislature can be good and bad. We as citizens of the state, we need to keep the pressure on them to do what they say they're going to do. So I wanted to make that point. They can pass legislation, but if they don't enact it, then what is it worth?
Yes.
And well, before we get to, we do have panelists on Zoom, and Joe had a comment. Before we get to the next question, I'll make sure we get Joe and Dave, and I can't remember who the third person is off of Zoom. Joe?
Stan.
Yeah, you saw my hand raised there. I was trying not to jump in. I feel like I apologize for not being there, but you know what I was going to say is the Live Local Act, you know, SB 102. I think there's a lot of potential there, and it was structured, I think, pretty smartly. You know, I think you know, when the legislation the final bill came out, you know, they did a good job of balancing incentives to incorporate workforce housing into projects, while not giving it as a massive boon to developers, you know, they're just going to go out and, you know, make a ton of money off it. So I think it was good balance, but I do think there's an opportunity there to use the funds from HUD paired with Live Local to put together some, you know, interesting mixed income projects, right? Which I think I think that's got to be a big part of like the focus. It's not just doing 100% purely affordable communities, but figuring out ways to incentivize mixed income, right? Where you can have, you know, market rate, workforce, and affordable in one project and make it so that the economics still work for a market rate developer to incorporate those units into a project, right? So that you don't have a concentration of low income housing in a low income area, and you kind of incorporate, you know, different income levels into one property, into an area. So I just want to say that I think Live Local provides a big opportunity, especially when paired with these funds, right? We could put together some interesting programs that incentivize the development of mixed income, which is typically pretty hard to do, you know, using tax credits with market rate.
Yes, sir.
Better? All right.
There you go.
Just so people are aware, another development company, but we've been doing workforce housing more in New York, and now we're doing stuff in Florida. I've since moved down here, but we have 336 units approved, and we'll start construction soon. That'll all be 120% AMI limited, according to the HUD definition in Fort Myers off of Hanson. And we have another project, be 319 units. We're going in for PUD approval on the 20th with City Council in Fort Myers. And then we have another project under contract in North Fort Myers off of Old 41 that would hopefully be 400 units. We're planning on using the live local law. But I think there's some things people need to understand about using those programs. And I think there's some experience we have doing that I think is, really relevant to this everyone here. With the workforce housing, we're building for $280,000 to $310,000 a unit for the workforce and workforce unit per unit. You're having to compete with a lot of market rate forces, whether that's, the land cost, which everybody was talking about. And you're also still dealing with a lot of different NIMBY and other things, for our PUD that we were going in for approval. We went in front of the planning board for 319 units of, we said outright 120 units, and the planning board still declined to recommend it for approval in the city. So I think from an approval standpoint, and then from a live local standpoint, I'll tie these 2 points together. You still have to enter, unless the city or a county, I think, opts into the program. My understanding is you're going to have to earn into our LoRa with Florida Housing Finance Corp., which for us is not a problem, but you're going to enter into probably a little bit more like a Section 8 type process or approval process, which again isn't an issue, but we've been doing that. I used to say we've been doing that 80 to 120% AMI program. I can't touch below 100% anymore. The costs aren't there. They don't work. And now we're approaching more towards that 120. But, I think that everyone here and how I'm starting to think about it and how the incentives are starting to structure is, the affordable LIHTC space has a whole subset of industry standards. You're going after these tax credits, you're getting these cost benefit agreements with the city, taxes. I think that everyone here should be thinking about maybe the same type of almost model for workforce attainable housing. And whether that definition is 120, 130%, whatever, if this is something that everybody recognizes that need and want, you need to kind of start removing a lot of the barriers or obstacles. Whether that's, us taking 6 to 8 months to get a DO approval on a workforce housing project, or even as something as simple as, impact fees. So you have on the affordable space, you almost have a program or an archetype on that everyone's using to put together the affordable programs. And obviously there's other issues with affordable that still needs to happen to keep that moving forward. But I think that that's something that also needs to be looked at in the county and the city, city level as well, different cities. But
Tom, can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Just for clarity? You just stated that your costs are between $280,000 and $310,000 per unit. Is that a fully loaded cost per unit?
Yeah.
From lands?
Yeah. All
And
I mean, interest rates are hopefully transient, but,
yeah,
but
and,
yeah.
And how many subsidies do you have stacked in that?
In that one, we have live local and TIF, and then we were in an enterprise zone. So we had a significant reduction in our impact fees, but not a waiver.
So relatively on a percentage basis, how much is that going to save you?
Well, it helps you on the, there's no, maybe a couple points, because most of that's on the DSCR. It's on the NOI side. It's not.
So basically no subsidies, just for clarity.
A couple points. Yeah.
And you're still able to deliver 120%.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. I think that's the other point that, I think everybody in this, if we're talking about attainable housing, which is our expertise and our skill set, I think people kind of almost lump it together, and they shouldn't, with, the standard luxury or upscale apartment. And it's not. It's hard to do. And I think, I don't know if it's, and thoughts of how you would do that is almost an overlay. If you had like a corridor or an area where you wanted to see, whether Joe was talking about the mixed use projects, or you're talking about areas where you want to see density, because you still need the density, like everyone's saying. There's just, that's the only way around these land costs.
Tom, I'm sorry, I'm driving at a comment rather than a question
Oh,
here
okay.
is,
Still
yeah,
it out there.
no, you know, my frustration and challenge is you're doing at market with almost no subsidies between 280 and 310,000 a key. And every subsidized transaction that I see, the hard cost are between 320 and $475,000 per key. And so I'm trying to understand what happens within the government cluster that makes, if I only need $100,000 a key to subsidize, I've already overset the $100,000 against what Tom's able to deliver on a market based, just because of
Well,
what? Just because the government sucks and we can't literally figure it out? Because I don't think he's driving a Ferrari yet, or any of you that are involved.
you're talking
in
about
it.
LIHTC.
I'm talking about every one of them. I mean, anytime you go through any of these capital stacks, it seems like the cost associated to affordable housing is between 50 and 100% more to accomplish.
I mean, that's an industry-wide LIHTC issue, right? I mean, they make, it's a fee-based development model where, there's no incentives to keep construction costs under control. There's no incentives. The developer makes all their money up front. I mean, that's an issue with that model.
Yeah.
And I think for my project where I was just talking about 2010 Hanson, I was also able to very smartly use density. We have about a 6-acre site. And it was a future land use of a high intensive zoning. So it was 30 units an acre. And then City of Fort Myers, I like this part of their code. If you have a 1-bedroom under 750 square feet, you can count it as half a dwelling unit. So then from a dwelling unit standpoint, I'm at like 60 dwelling units an acre, which allowed me to get to that point. We're in a high intensive area that can accept and work with that density within the community, but
My driver and point that I'm trying to get at is if I want Marcus to build more units and you to build more units, I can't keep adding $100,000 subsidy and $100,000 cost and think that I'm going to get any more units. So what is the outcome that we can get to that eliminates that Jeannie can run through and get dollars down so that maybe we could, it wouldn't cost $25,000 a unit to get you to 80% AMI.
him and I are taking the same risk on this approval, land entitlement, NIMBY, which is maybe half the problem. I think when he goes through a year or two of approvals and it doesn't get approved, I can't imagine how much money they waste on stuff like that.
I think, but also when it comes to, affordable housing and working with the housing authority or working with government agency, many housing authorities, they lack the expertise, and we have to bring in hired people to work with us as well. Dan, we were talking about this. And I think it is a model issue with the LIHTC program, and the developer fees are steep, the legal costs are steep. And I come from a family of attorneys, by the way. But they are, there are fees, I think, Dan, that you find in our typical deals that perhaps you may not find in a private market deal. It's unfortunate because we need the housing, and that's just something we gotta figure out. It's a great question. I like what Tom is saying, but that is a hurdle that we got to figure out how to get over because lots of times my experience has been when people come in the room and developers are in the business to make money, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes they come in and they see a housing authority or government agency, and they think about ways that they can, charge a little bit more than they typically would charge in a market rate deal. And so we've had those conversations with people up front that, look, we're not paying this, even though you may have gotten it from another housing authority in Florida, we're not paying that kind of fee. And there's also, Dan, there's a fee split, as you know. And so housing authorities now are in the business of making fees as well. And I'm not going to apologize for that. And here's why I'm not. Because we're going to take those fees and we're going to put them back into another project, right? We're not profit driven.
Well, that's why it's okay for you. My ask over to Jeannie is say, hey, can we get control of land, take it through zoning and hold it for our housing authorities or CDCs or whatever the entity is to take the de-risk down so that I don't have to go buy a developer for Marcus to go do a deal. To me, the example is what Steve in the city of Fort Myers has done is said, hey, we'll take lots, we'll build on them and we'll sell them at cost. All risk is gone, no construction financing, that's impossible. Like, what are the mechanisms that the county can do that take this de-risk? And I don't care if you can make a fee because you're not taking it home. You're just doing it for another housing development.
Correct. Exactly.
I think to answer your earlier question, so one of the challenges about why does it cost so much for subsidized housing versus what Renaissance is doing, right? Like they're just doing it on their own. To Marcus's point, hiring a grant writer, hiring a person to do Davis-Bacon compliance, Section 3 compliance, environmental reviews, like all of those different steps that come with federal subsidy that Renaissance is not having to deal with. They can go and purchase and build. And that is beyond, local government control. That is federal legislator saying, okay, we need to remove some of the restrictions on this. And to Marcus's point, I mean, you look at a map of the parties that are involved and have to be involved in a closing for a LIHTC deal, it's insane. So those different layers that come with that federal subsidy do add to the cost of that. And those are advocacy efforts that I think we could continue to ask for, is reducing some of that red tape at the state and even federal level.
Jeannie, a quick follow-up on that specifically. Is there a model, or have you seen a model anywhere where there is a role of local government or even maybe state government to create a funding mechanism to offset all of those, or some sort of strategy at the local level to offset all of those additional expenses to build attainable and workforce housing?
Yeah, I mean, Miami is a good example. They have a food and beverage tax that is specifically for housing and homelessness services. There's some changes in the legislature that will potentially prevent that from being modeled in other communities, but there are models all across the state of different municipalities that have created renewable funding sources.
Hotel tax is pretty common.
So I have it's kind of like a follow-up to what everyone is saying. Looking at the earlier slide, talking about the construction cost of infrastructure and parking, and including the cost of land. So if those three items were identified as something that is within the control of government, because we have a land trust. If we deal with the infrastructure, the lowering the parking, that's helped quite a bit on the cost of the project. The other part of the infrastructure, like the infrastructure is one of those items that if is for low and mid-income housing based on the CDBG-DR and maybe with the Live Local Act, some three items that can be reducing the cost for the developer. So one of the challenges, because I deal with developers that do housing often, is that they want to take advantage of these incentives, but oftentimes they're not there to stay. They're there to do the deal, make the money and get out. Government is not going to particularly sit comfortable with that, because then you're supporting someone's development and they're not in it to stay. How do we look at it from a development perspective, from developers and from local entities? How do we resolve that issue? Because that is an issue.
Yeah, Joe, do you have some comments?
I was just going to say, having been on the market rate development side, and then also being involved on the affordable side with the LIHTC deal, just to comment on, I think, Dan's question about why is it so much more expensive. I think we had on one phone call, a conference call, 42 attorneys on one just like weekly call. And there's a lot of layers of costs added on to your typical deal. So if I compare market rate development to a LIHTC project, the amount of, as Marcus said, consultants, attorneys, CPAs, other developers that are involved, everybody's getting paid. And it just adds so many layers of cost to it. And then in addition to that, I think Tom said it, it's a fee-based model that almost incentivizes higher costs, right? So I think it's a potentially just overall structural issue with how the program is kind of operated and how the incentives are. You kind of have this incentive system that doesn't really give a whole lot of reason to developers to bring those costs down, right? So I think that's a big issue with the LIHTC and affordable space, at least from my perspective, kind of being involved in one and comparing it to market rate transactions.
Well, and one other thing too is, we've been thinking about it and we've been approached to do LIHTC projects because our experience is not that far off from that. But when I then goes, all right, so what's the project? What's the process for getting a 9% allocation? Well, cross your fingers and hope in 2 years that you get an allocation. It's just like, I can get this thing approved and started in hopefully 18 to 24 months. I might not even have approvals or you know what I mean? So you have a lot of developers, whether it's Joe or myself or others, they're kind of, you have to overbill because the risk is so high. And I think that's another part of that problem with just that process.
So we have both David, Heidi, and then we have somebody here from Cape Coral. Like, what is from a Cape Coral perspective? So we've sort of talked a little bit about the county. We've talked a little bit about the city of Fort Myers. Like from a Cape Coral perspective, like how is this? How do you all see this playing out as it relates to the city? 200,000-ish people, 4 units to the acre for the most part. How is this starting to play out from a financial perspective for the city of Cape Coral as we think long term?
So I think everyone knows that the city of Cape Coral is fairly unique, being what is in essence a giant subdivision and predominantly 10,000 square foot lots. So the majority of our problem lies in the fact that we don't have large multifamily properties. That is a very big problem for us. And the ones that we have are getting eaten up by market rate. We had 9,000 units in the pipeline right now of multifamily. Of those, 150 were affordable. So we know that that's an issue. We also know that we aren't in the housing development world, right, as a government. So we are trying to do the best we can to look at our policies and change those policies to facilitate the development as best we can. But as we said at the beginning of this, politics always come into play, as well as the public, right? So we generally have a difficult time trying to get changes to our policies put in place. In 2019, we went through a complete code change. It had everything we're talking about here. We had ADUs in the zoning code. We had increased density by right for affordable housing written in. We had micro cottages because we still regulate house size in Cape Coral. So we had all of these initiatives and we talked about it for 4 years, and it got to 2 months before and the public got wind of one thing and everything went out the window. So for us, it is an education thing, right? And I think it's actually countywide. Let's be honest, countrywide, right? Is that we have to change the conversation, right? And we have to make people realize and not say, we're having an affordable housing issue. We have an attainable housing issue. We have I've heard life cycle housing problem before. Whatever we want to bill it, right? We have a housing affordability issue in Lee County. And we have to be realistic in Lee County as a whole, that the housing stock that we're building does not meet the needs of the majority of people working in this community. Period. End of story. If you look at the jobs that are coming online, they're not high paying jobs. So, from our perspective, we're going to keep moving forward by trying to bring policies forward. We were successful in increasing our density. I mean, we went from no more than 16 dwelling units an acre to we now have a 25 unit an acre zoning district. With Live Local, I see that's going to make a huge impact in Cape Coral for sure. And I think because one component of that is that density component, right? You think, I think people say, 25 dwelling units an acre. Well, guess what? In South Cape, the density is 125 dwelling units an acre. That is our max density. That comes into play under Live Local as well. So I think you're going to see more opportunity with us with that.
I was going to say Stan Gamont, who I used to work for when I was at HUD. Lots of experience at the federal level. So Stan, do you have some comments?
I mean, it's been a bit of an interesting conversation to this point, hearing what the various points of view that we've got here. There are a number of different ways to go about tackling some of the issues that I've been hearing about. to the idea of, well, can there be a subsidy provided to developers? Well, there's an opportunity to do that depending on the nature of the unit you get at the end of the day. The idea of low-income housing tax credits, how long it might take to get those and the uncertainty associated with it. Don't know if anybody has talked to housing, the state housing agency with regard to the QAP about whether there's a potential for a carve out. Some states have done things like that in the past for disaster impacted areas. And again, if you need some other approaches for eligible activities to support these projects, think them through carefully and then ask HUD for additional waivers on these things. Again, lots of ways to go about this and to facilitate it. Hurdles are hurdles, but they can be gotten over in many cases. There's some things you can't move, but I think that there are ways and there are examples about how to work around these particular problems. And we just need to mind those things.
Great, thanks, Dan. And Melanie, I know from an FGCU perspective and the work that you all are doing around workforce, what are your thoughts on how this relates to not just our workforce we have now, but our workforce we're going to have in the future? Are you still there, Melanie?
Let me jump in before we move too far away from the comment that was just made. When the gentleman mentioned QAP, which is acronym for Qualified Allocation Plan for Florida Housing Finance, it's basically the rules of how they're going to award the tax credits. They've established a goal for Lee County, funding. I think it's 3 developments in Lee County, I believe. So, although and I'm not sure if it's in the QAP, but they did establish goals. Which is a good start.
Can you say QAP again?
QAP, Qualified Allocation Plan, which is the rules of how the credits are awarded. My experience with Florida Housing over the 15, 16 years I've been working with them, they have been very inviting. They will listen to you if you have a unique problem in your community and it's fair to the rest of the state. They will certainly take it under consideration. But here's where I believe we have an opportunity. And Tom mentioned, and also I would like to also say that Joe, who's commented, he has a unique skill set. He has both affordable and market rate experience. I work with Joe. He's done some good stuff in this community. But Tom mentioned, 9% tax credits are they are oversubscribed every year. And the comment about waiting 2 years, sometimes you may wait 4 or 5 years to get an allocation, right? But I think we have a solution to that. And I mentioned it briefly in a conversation with Jeannie. I didn't go into too much detail, but 4% tax credits are undersubscribed. All right, because it's hard to find the gap financing to make the deal work. Well, now we have the gap financing. Okay. So I think at least from our perspective at Lee County Housing Authority, we've certainly internally discussed that as an option. And so we're excited about working with Lee County on 4%. And you've got the Lee County Housing Finance Authority right here. Phil Burnett and his team, they do a great job. So
just to cut to the chase on that, there's a 5% additional gap that rather than going after 9%, you go after 4%, which are guaranteed. And then Jeannie, will you give me 5%? And now I've got a 9% without as much 42 attorneys.
Correct. Oh, well, no.
Maybe 20.
No, the
I think we resolved the housing affordability issue.
The attorneys are going to be there. The attorneys are going to be there. But what Dan says, and he's right about that. I was on a closing call yesterday, and there were probably 42 people on the call. Not all attorneys, but a big number of them were. But no, there's a solution with the 4% credits, right? And Jeannie's going to have 1.1 billion. So we can get some stuff done. Let me make one other point, and then I'll be quiet so other people can get in this conversation. I was raised in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a predominantly African-American community, similar to what we refer to as the Dunbar community. In the 70s, we experienced white flight, right? All the white families moved out to the suburbs. The last 15 years, they moved back in, okay? We have communities that I grew up in where there are $75,000 homes. These are small homes, shotgun homes in some cases. There are $1 million houses beside them. If I didn't see it, I wouldn't believe it. Now, here's what I think may happen here. At Dunbar community, those values are about to jump. And we've got to figure out a solution there too, because people are going to be priced out of the Dunbar community. It's just a matter of time. All right. So we got to be aware of that as well. And again, we have an opportunity here. And if we blow this, shame on us. If we blow this opportunity.
So I see Melanie, so I'm gonna make one comment. Typically, in most communities, the loss of affordable housing is greater than the production of new housing, because most communities don't have policies in place to maintain the affordable housing that they have. And so it's a two-pronged thing. Yes, there need to be incentives for new development, but there also need to be incentives to maintain the stock that exists. I know Melanie's on the line.
Yes, good morning. Melanie Schmies, Manager of Sponsored Programs at the Regional Economic Research Institute. I apologize. I stepped away for a quick minute. And of course, that is the time where I had heard my name called. So happy to answer anything that I can. Otherwise, I'm happy to be part of the discussion and just listen. Thank you.
So Melanie, the question we sort of posed was, related to the work that you all are doing at FGCU around workforce, like housing is a workforce problem also. And so what we were talking about is what are you seeing both now and into the future related to that, that it's going to take for, whether it's employers, it's not just about developers, but it's also about the employers. Like what is it going to take from what you're seeing related to the work at FGCU?
Sure. So my work is mainly tied to, as you'd stated, a large workforce development grant. And really the target for this grant is underserved communities, upskilling, reskilling, doing rapid credentialing for folks to get into better jobs, good paying jobs in our community. I know that even when we first were awarded this money and talking about the project, a lot of the questions we were getting were, well, even people with good jobs can't afford to live here. So like, why are we even trying to build and work on this system in our community when it became an issue of affordable housing and workers can't afford to live here. So is this even something that our community wants to focus on? And that was really surprising to hear. I understand where the comment came from. So obviously we're still working to address the issues of workforce upskilling, reskilling, creating this whole system of wraparound services, whether it be childcare, transportation, gas cards to get to trainings and to jobs. But at the end of the day, it is going to come back, and it does come up in conversations about at what point in this project and in the larger scope of what we're trying to build here, are we addressing affordable housing, and how do we bring in the right people into that conversation? So if we're touting, job growth and job placement and workforce development, we have that critical component. We have not, and I'm talking about a specific project here, not really what the university is doing as a whole, but it is something that we need to integrate into the discussion. So I'd love to lean on everyone that's also involved in this conversation to assist. And this conversation has certainly helped to bring some thoughts and comments back to the group.
Thank you for those comments. One of the questions that's on here, and particularly in the context that we're meeting, there are additional requirements for energy conservation. Obviously, climate issues, production of local energy, microgrids, et cetera. That's become, a part of the discussion. But also the issue about resilience, building more resilience into housing and other structures. How does that impact the cost of development, and is that another additional burden? I mean, you know, I joked when I was at HUD and having worked for local government, we want everything. I mean, if you look at the HUD regs regarding, you know, the DR, we want affordable housing, we want accessible housing, we want housing that's resilient, we want housing that's energy efficient, we want housing. So, I mean, in the context of all the things that society is layering on housing and housing production, you know, how does that impact what we're doing? And is that a good thing, a bad thing? I mean,
I think it's a good thing, but I think the price goes up. I mean, the price goes up significantly when you start to add all those layers in. And I'm gonna look to Marcus, because Marcus, you were around with Coconut Cove, weren't you?
Right.
That cost per unit was pretty significant, and that's a LEED platinum building, and it.
Yeah, it's, I mean, you know, Amy's right. It's great to have that, especially in a state where we have to deal with the occasional hurricane.
only
So,
takes one.
yeah, it only takes one, and you're right, the cost is gonna go up, Dan, and so, but you've got to build structures where people are safe in their homes. And I don't think it's an option. I think in Florida, we have to build resilient housing. I just don't think I think it's non-negotiable. But it's going to increase the cost. We got to figure that out. It's going to be another hurdle, a financial hurdle.
I think you're just gonna have to, you don't have to go full blown, I'm doing LEED platinum. You're just gonna have to balance it out really and get the best bang for your buck as far as.
I'm gonna make a comment on that because that's a lot of the bulk of what I do. I'm a sustainability consultant. The building codes, the Florida Building Code has been well aligned with some of the Code Plus standards. LEED is not the only flavor. There is National Green Building Standard that is well aligned with the Florida Building Code. You have Green Gloves, so you have different choices now. And I can tell you that the regular building code has strengthened a lot of their challenges, you know, for hurricane resiliency, but also for energy efficiency. So the gap is, you know, what we talked about 10 years ago is not the same anymore, because every single housing project that is funded by HUD has to be certified green. And it's kind of like a third-party audit guarantee that we're building a quality product. So that gap is not as large as it used to be.
And I just wanted to add too, is we also did a LEED platinum apartment project 6 years ago, and it's just, you don't need to do those programs. You need to do probably just the NGBS program or whatever. And the Florida Building Code is, you know, is pretty good. So it's just adding unnecessary cost. The resiliency stuff, yeah, I agree. That's like non-negotiable. You gotta.
And I will add to that if, I'm sorry, Gary, if we are looking at green building codes for resiliency, developers can add energy tax credits as part of their layering of incentives to their projects. So you can get up to $2,500 on energy tax credits per unit.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna thank you for bringing that up. I agree 100%. These programs are well intended, but I go back to what Jeannie was saying about doing things like Davis-Bacon compliance. It adds cost, and nothing against these programs, but I think our building code currently, if you look at the structures, they did well without those types of programs. And I did want to circle, my head's still exploding from the conversation, I think, between Dan and Renaissance about how some of these market rate costs are below the affordable, and your comment about the lawyers getting paid. I do want to challenge this group. You know, we're not here to say those lawyers are going to have to be there. Marcus said that because that's your experience, I'm sure, right? They do have to be there. But our goal needs to be to get outside of that. And all right, how do we reduce that burden so that we can get these projects going? And we shouldn't be afraid to go to the federal government. And I heard, trying to make sure I get the names right here, Stan, talk about getting relief from some of that stuff. We need to be willing to ask for relief from those things if they're going to make the projects go forward.
Exactly what relief are you seeking? Because some things can be done and some things cannot.
I agree. Administrative burden that doesn't, I mean, there's administrative burden that makes sure there's not fraud. That we never want to touch that.
Yeah.
We're sure that we're doing things that are above board. But administrative burden, again, I use Davis-Bacon as the example because we have to do it as a company a lot. It is a burden, and it doesn't add value to the project, to be perfect.
Yeah, that's one where HUD can't help, because Congress in providing this money said very directly, that is an area where HUD cannot use its statutory waiver and alternative requirement authority. It's a sore point, but you can ask, but that's an easy no for HUD because they just don't have the authority. Same would go for most environmental requirements.
Understood. So maybe we have to ask somebody else who can grant that authority. All they can say is no.
Congress wrote the law.
I'm going to derail the conversation for just a minute. So we're looking at financial incentives, but from a social science perspective and from a planning perspective and a historical perspective, we need to understand how we got here. And I am a pioneering family of the area. I'll just throw that out there. But the way, and Amy can speak to this, that most of Southwest Florida was built on a retirement dream. It was built on a tourism vacation destination. The Rosen brothers in Cape Coral, and I'm just going to speak from my history, were marketing geniuses. The way our area has been developed to be a place to visit and retire and then go on, whatever that means. Growing up in Cape Coral, it was called Cape Coma, and Fort Myers was called Fort Misery. And being a child in this area was typically awful because it was made of mostly people that were sold a dream to come down here after they worked their lives, bring their money, retire, enjoy beautiful, sunny Florida, whether it's a gray sky day or a blue sky day, okay? So I want to go back to the context. If we're looking at how we fix our housing problem, we need to spend some money in looking at things. And I know we're going to get to this in the next session, but we have to look at the pockets of opportunity that are there for the workforce, for the infrastructure support that can fix the problem of the people that came here without thinking of all the things that they need to live here. So I just want to also highlight the Dunbar area, the Harlem Heights area. Those were the folks that were here to grow our food, to grow our magnolia flowers that we sent out, and to support the services that we needed to come to vacation here, to retire here, to die here, okay? So let's think about the context of the problem that we have. We have a retirement community that was sold on a dream on the back of a Camel cigarette box that you came down here, you went wined and dined to buy and build in a swamp, okay? We had people to support that, but those people, whatever they looked like, were never, the land was never planned to support a urban, suburban environment. It was never designed to support the infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the infrastructure we need for water, electricity, resiliency that we're talking about today. So I love these conversations and I'm learning so much from all of you. And I know we're going to tackle this in the next session. I just want to remind you that there is opportunity to finance from a planning perspective, from a land development perspective, the opportunities that are there to build and be resilient for what's coming, and the support services and the folks that we need to maintain that dream that drives our economic development here.
So are there, following on that, are there incentives that are in place or could be developed that would help focus development into vacant land or along transit corridors or in a way that, you know, makes sense from an infrastructure perspective and doesn't totally, you know, run up against sort of the cultural or historic development patterns that are here sort of along that? Are there opportunities for that to occur, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think just maybe this will echo some of what you were saying, but what we were doing in New York and how we're changing it for down here was mostly urban infill. So it was old historic buildings that were vacant. And then we actually did historic rehabilitations. We put them on the National Register, get historic tax credits. And that's how we filled the funding gap up there. You know, I think down here, at least if you're talking about the areas that are already built up and not doing the you got 50 acres kind of somewhere on the outskirts. And I think this is the same for the LIHTC affordable. There's a lot of sites, or there are sites that are, 3 to 10 acres that are not big enough for a full market rate or a luxury development. But with the right overlay, or if there was a official program that's kind of spelled out, I think then you could easily, especially getting to the point where you have kind of known path for entitlement that's not open-ended to a NIMBY, a board being influenced by NIMBY, you can then, have those infill opportunities or those kind of transitional areas to be used to make, whether it's a affordable, a mixed income, or a workforce attainable housing project. And I think that's it's a little bit of our business model, is we try to go find those places and try to find those transitional areas and do that. And I think it also affects the land price comment you were making, because if it's below a certain number of acres and it's X density, you kind of don't have a great use for it outside of these types of projects. And then you start getting into how do you fix transportation and parking, and then you start looking at bus lines and that sort of stuff. And it's kind of a process we've seen done a couple times.
So this might be a good opportunity for me to jump in just in terms of some of the things that Cape Coral has developed on the incentive front. I think Joe may have been the person to mention this, that, there is a model where if we look at different levels of income within a particular project where there's some affordable housing, some market rate housing, that those type of projects would qualify for the city of Cape Coral's incentives. We've looked at the infrastructure costs of sites and put together programs that will help with all of that site development work to kind of help address those additional costs before you start to build vertical. So our programs do provide assistance to that, but right now it's primarily for mixed use. It has to be some commercial that's integrated in with that. And that gets to the challenges that Jennifer talked about in terms of how Cape Coral is laid out. We're a pre-platted community. There is kind of a battle of those properties that are available and that are large sites, because we need commercial. We need those areas where jobs can be addressed in investments for businesses. So, we've got a challenge on our hands in terms of trying to address our commercial needs, our job creation needs, as well as housing.
Hi, biggest land trust in the state right here. But it's a great question. We often we almost exclusively use the land trust for, we've identified a piece of property, we've identified the developer partner we're going to work with, we've identified the funding, and we're going to put the land into the trust either at closing or when we are getting underway actively with the project. We very rarely use the land trust for land banking with the idea of assembling or going through the entitlements process to tee it up to make it easier for a developer to build what we know we need to get built there. But it's certainly a tool we should keep in the toolbox. To your point also about mixed use development, I think we should keep in mind as we think about this for longer term planning. Was talking with a county elsewhere in the state about this a while ago. It's probably easier to build straight multifamily residential at whatever your market rate is, much more difficult to include that slice of commercial on the ground floor. But if we don't build it there, we're not going to go back 10 years from now when we need it and raise the building and stick a commercial first floor in there, right? So we've got to figure out ways to incentivize also. And it may be things like, saw a great project with this in Clearwater a few years ago. The ground floor retail was leased out for like $1 a foot to nonprofits. So we've got somebody in the building, we've got a little activation, we've got some people that want to go out to lunch locally and things like that. Until we get enough density, enough critical mass of people living in the area. And now we can start saying, thanks, you got your 3 or 4 years of really cheap rent. Now we're ready to bring in a Panera or, a local business to start filling up this space. So we need to be thinking about not just infrastructure support, but also probably ways to subsidize that commercial for 5 or even 10 years
You
to
know,
get what we need.
related to the mixed use, the new buzzword is the 15-minute neighborhood. The idea that, you're creating these neighborhood pods where you can walk to work, you can walk to the grocery store, you can walk to a restaurant and live in the neighborhood and reduce your dependence on transportation. How effective, how much opportunity do you think there is within this context for that kind of development pattern to emerge?
Well, I think if you look at like Lee County unincorporated, it's their code for like the mixed use overlay, which I think should just be expanded. So that would effectively reduce the open space requirements. So when you do that, you go from 40 down to 20, which increases your density right away. And you also can deliver a lower parking ratio. So I think if you look at Inspiration South on College Parkway, the old goat farm, they're in the mixed use overlay. So that parcel was effectively able to reduce the 2.1 units per or parking space per units down to 66% of that. So that saves them 1.4 acres. So when you look at land costs and just fill costs in the whole 9 yards, they effectively were able to increase density up to, I think, 23 units per acre there, which is one of the higher ones in the actual county in the unincorporated areas. So I think by expanding those mixed use overlays and looking at the open space requirements can actually incentivize development.
Because I think one of the things that Frank mentioned in his comments, it's not necessary that we build 20 years out today. So the idea that there is a process by which land is developed, you put that 1-story retail on, but it's built in such a way that it's adaptable for upper floors, or that it can be torn down easily and redeveloped, because our cities are continuing to evolve. But that takes, I think about long-term planning. Yeah, there's the 10-year vision, but then there need to be strategic plan elements of that says in the next 2 years, these are our goals. And then the market's going to move around the next 2 years. These are our goals. So an incremental planned way of beginning to think about how the environment evolves. And so the kind of planning and incentives that we've talked about here, are those in place, or do there need to be more of that in place?
I mean, before the storm, the county had begun reviewing its mixed use overlay policies and had added quite a bit of new acreage in North Fort Myers specifically. Subsequently, we're going back and reviewing, they'll talk about this in the next session, but examining Summerlin and some of the trailer parks and how they can be brought back as mixed use development with the types of, the types of densities that are required to make it work. But the other thing we're missing, from the commercial perspective, is we don't use new markets tax credits here. And so we've only had 4 projects in all of Southwest Florida. We're in this building is a beneficiary of being the third one. But we won't use them, and they've been used for not-for-profit. So we've done no commercial new markets tax credits, which puts 25 to 30% of equity into the deal for free. Markets has been trying to pull off a project for a while now. And Dan's has tried to learn more about it, but there's no one here that has a particular competency and they're complicated like any other bond deal. And they're expensive. The transaction costs are very high. I think Lee Health will be the next one that does one. But it's something that needs to be brought into the equation. The last thing, where I thought we were going to go was some of the cost. And I think, the developers do this in their performance every day. And I think Frank's actually done this academically. But, we're considered a deadhead community, meaning, our rail and our trucking goes back empty often after it brings deliveries here. And that adds 10% of cost to our local materials. And I'm sure Gary deals with that all the time. Our rail, excuse me, our rail is down because of the storm. Can't cross the Coosawhatchee. So Raymond supplies has gone up exponentially. Labor has gone up 18% over the last 18 months, which is a good thing, but it's a cost that, and I think, and then we've had lots of discussions with BIA, our industry, building industry association, about, using alternative materials that may be less expensive, but it's a herd mentality. To get the first contractor to decide that they're going to use bamboo, for trusses, it's going to take a regulation to make that happen. And I don't blame them, but all these sort of things go into the cost, and we haven't talked about insurance. And so, that's going to be the other, burden that we have to address. So we can have incentives, but those incentives, and I think the Florida Housing Finance Corporation did a very good job at trying to add money back to the different deals that they were in to make up for some of the material inflation that they were having to deal with. But we can do a lot of this work to create incentives, and it's just going to cover where we would have been 2 years ago. Before we had, done, to Jennifer's point, have been, sort of stayed up to date with us all along. The good news is there's so much job growth, and it's good job growth that's going on in some parts of the county. We've got 9 million square feet under construction along the Alico corridor, with 12 million square feet in the pipeline along the interstate somewhere, whether it's Luckett Road or Alico or whatnot. And we're making a historical amount of improvement, investments in our roadways to make some of those commuting times from Lehigh Acres to their job place less expensive or less difficult. We have the longest distance commute of any county in the state of Florida. And so when we talk about the 35% people pay for a housing cost, they're paying 25% of their household income in car costs, where the US average is 12%. And so when we add those two numbers together, you're at 60% before you buy your first grocery or pay for insurance or anything like that. So there's a whole ecosystem that has to be unraveled and reorganized to rationalize what we're trying to accomplish.
So that's normally you're teeing that up for my request for mixed use development, which is my consistent, but just some component of that is we've had the benefit of, it's Friday, we were here on Monday talking about infrastructure, transportation, utilities and some of these things. And so kind of an ask around the financial incentive is in a ranking mechanism and a support side. If somebody tees up all 5 components, as there's new lines of water and sewer in the area, there's new transportation hubs. If you've got cultural components and medical components all in the same area, can you increase the probability of receipt of those funds and increase the funding? I think would be kind of the ask from my perspective to say, hey, can we get some linear? And then from a functional and development perspective, one of the areas that I think the government's goal and role should be is 100-year horizon return on capital type of mindset versus an investor developer that's exposed. So if it's not needed, rather than not building it today, let the government take that role of saying, hey, I'll build the parking garage over the retail that supports the 4 businesses and the multifamily in one place, because we know that efficiency of land does increase our probability of all of those things going down the cost of execution. So even layering in where it's, hey, incentive to those groups, but also we're actually going to put infrastructure in that hub component.
If I may, thank you, Dan, that's brilliant. I love that concept of what you're talking about. This has been an incredible panel. So thank you all for sharing what you have going on. Just to give some feedback. So I work with community assisted supportive living, nonprofit developer. But what we do is we build and we hold. And we house folks that make 60% or less of AMI, people with chronic mental health problems, substance abuse, chronic homelessness, and affordable housing. So to Marcus's point, the 9% tax credit, this is such a complex business model. So here we have a project, we've secured the 9% tax credits, takes forever. It wasn't our first go around. Now we're just missing a little bit of money. If we don't get that next little bucket of money, there goes the 72 units we're trying to bring into Cape Coral. But that's how this system works. It seems kind of backwards to me. I 100% agree with you, Marcus. The 4% tax credits is how we're going to build the pipeline. We'll get more done with the 4%, because for those of you that aren't familiar with the 4%, we don't have to compete. Our last competition that we lost at Florida Housing Finance Corp, there was only, I think, 3 of us in it, and we lost to Miami-Dade. So these are really tough competitions. So 4% is really where we're going to get our leverage. We talked a little bit about green building LEED certification. We've decided as an organization that we are going to build our properties resiliently. We are putting on metal roofs. We are doing lysine in our attics. We are putting in generators because we do house vulnerable populations. We feel responsible. Plus also there's a business argument for it. Our renewal on our insurance premium, astronomical. So we're going to have to get creative as in our space as we hold these properties, because to your point, you should never apologize for your fees, because that's how no margin, no mission, we can't build a greater pipeline. So my last, I love the idea of a land bank and a land trust. I think I'm hearing that's a great opportunity. So in order, from where I'm sitting, because I wear two hats, right? I'm also on the Lee Health Board and we have a workforce housing shortage. So what I would like to know, is there data out there in Lee County that's broken down into AMIs? Because obviously, to Joe Bernaro, dead on, we can layer the 60% AMI housing. I'm excited about it. We are doing some of that up in Sarasota. How do we know what is our do we have a strategic plan in Lee County around area median incomes, where that gap in housing is? But I want to see it translated into what those jobs are. So we sit here and we say 60% AMI. How much of our workforce in Lee County fits in 60% AMI? Maybe there are developers in this space today or out there that would be interested if we say, you know, we could master lease with a big employer. I'm looking at Chris over here, Lee County School District. There's all these different things, but until we know what that strategy looks like, till we know what that gap is. So is there anything like that, John? I'm looking right at you and Jeannie.
I mean, I think I'll let Jeannie answer the most of it, but I think, you know, about 4 years ago, the county between our 8 Human Veteran Services, DCD, really tried to work collaboratively to begin to develop that strategy. We've started creating pots of allocation that you can depend on if you can apply for if you're going to apply for 9% or you know, where you need a local contribution. So the strategy is emerging. I think 1.1, whether there's enough money or not, at least gives us the opportunity to create a strategy. As for the data, we have the data at the household level. I mean, you know, broken up by, you know, where you work and how much you earn, and we can aggregate that, you know, at a census tract level or census block level, you know, any AMI strata that you want, any occupation you want. We know exactly where, you know, who we're talking about. And you know, I think the information we've gathered through the individual assistance program, you know, the 55,000, 60,000, you know, families and phone calls we've taken has given us even more insight into where those needs are. So we haven't had a chance to publish this or to really put it out because it's been so recent. But I think that's one of our goals.
Yeah, I mean, like John said, we definitely do have the data of who are these people behind these income limits. And that is some of the stuff that we had put together pre-hurricane and presented and really started the conversation about, you know, how do we create sustainable funding sources? And yes, the 1.1 billion, I super appreciate Frank's math because that is the topic of conversation. But like Frank said, it's not the solution. It's not a sustainable, you know, model. It's not a renewable funding source. So while yes, we do anticipate doing, you know, a ton of support for 4% deals, the financing gap for or subsidy gap, I guess, for 4% between 9% on an average size development like Cypress Village, it could be as much as $7 or $8 million per development. So if someone's getting a you know, CDBG DR contribution for a 9% tax credit deal, they might be getting $1 million, $2 million. If they are getting a 4% deal, they're going to need 9, 10, maybe a little more millions of dollars to make that project whole. So that $1.1 billion, even if it were all dumped into housing, doesn't provide for a lot of subsidies to be made to align with those 4% tax credits. So while yes, that is absolutely the intention, is to, you know, partner with that 4% deal for as much money as we can dedicate to housing, I think it's important to continue to explore those sustainable funding models and different renewable funding sources to be able to keep this momentum going after the 1.1 is exhausted.
Can I jump?
Just real quick. One thing that I want to say, and is related to that, is that looking at, you know, we have to look at the bigger picture, but if we have the math put together about the gap that we have in housing and in our workforce and who we are trying to attract for resiliency without the CBGDR, it's an opportunity for us as a community, as a county, to put that financial case in front of HUD and say, we need to add 1 or 2 zeros to that amount of money.
I'll just jump in quickly to say, as a potential source of sustainable funding, when we're talking about 9 million square feet of industrial getting built, another 12 in the pipeline, what a great opportunity to have a linkage fee that says, with 21 million square feet of industrial operations, boy, somebody's gonna have to work in these places, right? Oh, they gotta go live somewhere at the end of the day, right? Housing is where jobs go to sleep. And so a linkage fee, we've got a great nexus there to find a way to sustainably fund a fund that can support workforce housing, to support all this kind of development. One possibility, I'll also mention, we've seen this like in Charlotte, talked to them several times about a regional housing impact fund, where banks and other major contributors are funding essentially below market rate mezzanine debt for these kinds of projects. That's one more way to fill the gap between what we have for equity from LIHTC and so forth, and other pieces. I want to point out too, because sometimes this escapes us, but the reason they're called the low income housing tax credits is they're tax credits. You have to have income to offset them against. Part of what makes them cost so much is almost nobody, not nobody, but almost nobody can consume the tax credits. So you have to pay an investment banker to syndicate them for you, to sell them off, right? And that's what makes these structures so complicated. So to the extent we can use CDBGDR in a more streamlined fashion and not load it up as if it's a tax credit, we can potentially save that 30% cost premium that goes into building LIHTC deals.
I just wanted one thing on the cost, because you keep talking about subsidizing, at least on the attainable, approaching that 120% AMI. I don't know how much is necessarily a subsidy versus when we go to look at a project and we have to calculate all the risk and taking 2 years to get this deal done or not done. Having almost a pipeline or an overlay or a process that we have, certainty of execution greatly changes how we look at a project. Same thing, it doesn't matter who they are in real estate. If they're looking at buying land and it's got 50 acres and they know they get as of right X units, someone will go after that project differently. So I think, knowing that, if there was almost a program for, at least on the attainable side, and I think it needs to look different, but along the same, procedures for affordable, knowing that you're going to get this approval, it's going to be an administrative process. You're not going to have to be in front of a board. You qualify for a TIF or a CBA. There's help on impact fees and maybe building permit fees, and maybe that's where some of the money needs to come from. But that may greatly reduce the ask. And that's something that we'll have to put in the pro formas as we do the projects. But I think, that would also potentially help a lot. So some of this is not necessarily a dollar subsidy in his example where, you got to put this 100,000. The attainable model may be more of a zoning planning process overlay. And that may get you a lot of the way there, but probably not all the way there, but a lot of the way there.
And a renewable potential source, right? Like if you can place the capital into a piece of land that has the assurance, and then it comes out of that position and goes into the next piece and goes into the next piece.
It depends. I think if, on some of the projects we're working on, if we knew we would be able to get through the process, when you're doing the development, it doesn't matter whether it's the affordable or not, you're trying to minimize your dollars up front until you have certainty of execution. Because if you spend a bunch of money and then it gets denied for some reason, you're just in trouble, and you're going to be
Just for the public's awareness, what type of dollars are you talking about? This is like the cost of a coffee cup, or like?
I think on 2010 Hanson, which we got our building permit approval and everything a couple months ago. We were millions of dollars. And
before you broke ground.
Before you break down, yeah.
And hundreds of thousands just to determine whether or not the site is compliant.
Yeah, and before you get even like, let's say, a planning approval or something where you would have approval, you're hundreds of thousands, if not into 7 figures. So from a developer standpoint.
So that's super high risk dollars.
Yep.
which tend high risk, high return. So if we take $2 million off the table of exposure that needs 100 to 200% type of return because you only get it back on occasion.
Well, but if there was, if go through my example of an overlay, if there was like, you knew you were going to get this amount of units, if you do this income limitation, or you're doing this type of program, those dollars aren't high risk dollars anymore.
To my point is you take something that needs 100% return down to somebody that you can go raise capital around and they need 8 to 12% return.
Yeah.
So if we land banked it and did all the entitlements and got it ready and teed up for you, your development timeline is shorter and your risk exposure is way lower.
Go ahead, jump in, John.
Because, tell them how long Hanson, Hanson has taken. Marcus, how long did Civitas take? I mean, yeah, it took a while.
So,
It took a while. It's a great investment of time and money, and there's risk involved. But again, we come at it from a different, perspective than Tom, because we're not profit driven and so, and I know they're trying to do good work in the community as well, but we invest that time and effort and more times than not, we get to an end product. I've got to admit that we've been extremely successful in Lee County, in part because of my time in Fort Myers, the city of Fort Myers, Lee County government, Cape Coral, the jurisdictions have supported these projects. So they end up working.
Not all Cape Coral.
I know,
Look,
I think we're gonna wrap this up. I know John's.
no, I'm famous, so we did run into one bump in Cape Coral.
So a lot of this is like great, fantastic momentum into what we're going to talk about starting at, I think, 11 o'clock. But I do want to wrap because we do need to have some time for public comment. And then obviously we have another session starting at 11. But I do want to not lose sight of a couple things that came out of this. So there is an opportunity, and it's been kicked around for the last several years, even before the hurricane, of this idea of there are some large employers in the region. And we have to John's point earlier in this week, to the point today, we have to have really thinking about our regional employers a lot. So there's this land banking opportunity, this actually capitalizing on a land trust model. There's this idea of what are the front end incentives or funding financial mechanisms to offset some of that, you're $1 million in before you ever even know if you're going to be able to build on the property. Like, what are some of those mechanisms that could be considered or built into that? And what you said, Marcus, I think is probably one of the most important things that we can't lose sight of, and we can't avoid the conversation, is this idea of how do we keep people in attainable homes, and how do we keep generational folks in their communities and their neighborhoods? Like, that has to be a priority as part of this conversation too. And so whatever you can share with us from the success they've had in Raleigh, I think there's a model there. I know there's other communities around the country that have models where they've been successful at that, of how we can replicate that. So before we close the conversation out, I just do want to let everybody know, I don't know if the screen's still shared or not, but this is the intake form that's on the Resilient Lee website. So if you have initiatives, you have ideas, they can be projects, they can be bigger, higher level picture, this idea of an overlay, which we'll talk a little bit more in depth in our next session. But this idea of what are these things that we could really start to be doing so we can build out the actual initiatives that would be part of that plan. So before I turn it over to public comment, we only have 5 minutes left of the time. Are there any other comments or questions that the branch has, or the panel? Any last thoughts before we close that out? And then we will turn it over to public comment.
I just want to make one quick comment. And having done consulting in communities, out of all the things that we've talked about, it's my opinion that the most important thing is political consensus. Because then if you have political consensus about the direction you want to go, you can make these tools work.
Very interesting comments today. I'm really enjoying the conversation as well. I want to point out that, we're talking about subsidies and financing, but there's a big segment of the market that we really aren't touching on, which is those people who are falling in between those, either the very wealthy or the very poor, which is quite frankly the mass majority of the people who are working here in Lee County. We have communities like Lehigh and Cape Coral that are just vast land banks in themselves, and countless thousands of lots that are yet to be developed. And what we need to focus on, I think, is the continual increasing of costs due to regulations and requirements to build these homes or these structures. The National Association of Home Builders, through their studies, have determined that at least 40% of the cost of construction is due to regulation. And every year we are regulated through additional code changes or issues with energy codes, which are ramped up every year, and the building code is ramped up every 3 years. And not that it's that there's not a real a goal that we're achieving there, because I think the results is what we've seen after the hurricane, that houses that are built to the current code and to the current elevation substantially are improved and do a great job of surviving these catastrophic events. You know, where we need to concentrate on are those communities that were not built to those standards. You know, we don't have new houses burning to the ground as frequently as we do old houses because of wiring issues and other things. But if you look at the code and look at the expense for things like electrical requirements now, or fire prevention requirements, or anything else, it's just extremely expensive to build. And we need to really look at that segment of the market that doesn't have the opportunity to get the subsidies or doesn't have the funds available to build housing. You know, it's PITI, right? Principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. The insurance is a big issue. We barely touched on that at all. The insurance industry drives a lot of these code requirements. And it's an issue that really needs to be addressed for the long term. Touch very briefly on impact fees. I heard a couple comments about that. You know, in years past, there's even been jokes about, you know, we'll have an impact fee for affordable housing. Well, that really is not a viable solution. What we need to find is other funding mechanisms for infrastructure, try to reduce the cost of housing. And we have rural sprawl, and that's because it's less expensive to build out in these rural areas. There are not a lot of fees associated with that. Still have an impact fee that's the same whether you're building rurally or not, but things like infrastructure costs for water and sewer and all these other things, when you build out in the sticks out in Lehigh, you're not paying those fees. So it's less expensive to build out there, but it's contrary to what we're trying to achieve, which is, you know, urban infill.
Thank you, Richard. And I think there's some great initiatives I heard you say that you want to put into this little form here that's on the resiliently.com website. Great, thank you. Any other comments from the branch or the panel? All right, so I'm going to close that conversation out. And if there's any members from the public that would like to share, please state your name and your organization.
Hi, my name is Betsy and I'm the coordinator for the Immigration Network. A couple of things. Insurance, thank you for bringing that up. There's a discussion recently that Citizen may raise their rates by 50%. So I think when we're talking about whatever the right terminology is, affordable, attainable, whatever, we have to take that insurance cost into it. And the other thing is, looking at where we consider risk and some of the incentives we have. So after Charlie in 2005, I was working with Goodwill and United Way on building disabled housing out there, had donated land, everything we had cost covered. We could not get any of the dollars through government because it's a barrier island, because it's at risk. So when we're talking about rebuilding communities, does that mean that affordable housing can no longer, workforce housing can no longer be in the barrier islands or on Sanibel or, you know, Fort Myers Beach? I think we have to consider that. It makes sense. You don't want those dollars to be at risk, but just something to consider where our workforce can actually be.
My name is Mike Love and I'm part of the NAACP. One of the speakers, I think the lady over there in that flower dress, I don't know your name, I'm sorry. You mentioned the sociological structure, and then there's a lot of statement made about Dunbar. If we use Dunbar as an example, we're going to realize that you cannot just drop affordable or attainable houses in the middle of Dunbar without changing, literally changing the community. That community was never built for anyone except low-income field workers, like you said. And if we're going to change that, I stop for a second. Most of our young people in Dunbar, they go off to the best colleges and they don't return. They don't return because Dunbar is not set up for a young generation. So if you are going to make Dunbar resilient, you have to change all of that. Dunbar is a food desert. Our children are not being properly fed because they can't get fresh food. So if you're going to change a place like Dunbar, there's a lot of work you have to do. And the money has to be there year after year after year to sustain it to where it become resilient.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Great. And with that, I'll close the public comment. I just want to say thank you to our panelists and our branch members. We can give them a round of applause for being here. Thank you. And for those that want to stick around, we will have 2 more sessions today. So next we're going to talk about land use and policy. And then this afternoon, we'll talk about permitting. Oh,
Hey,
Marcus.
John, just real quick to the lady's comment here. Prior to the hurricane, I was involved in conversations with Fort Myers Beach about workforce housing. So I know they've had a change at the top with the new mayor and a couple new council members, but the city manager who's no longer there, they were at that time very interested in workforce housing down at Fort Myers Beach. I don't know what their position is now with the new mayor and council.
Thanks, Marcus. All right.